and comfort me. You prepared a feast for me in the presence of my enemies. You honor me by anointing my head with oil. My cup overflows with blessings. Surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will live in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. So here we are, the first week of August, and let me tell you, summer is not meant to be this fast. I feel like I'm gonna put out a petition. Maybe it's because my kids are still so small that school should start in October. So then maybe I would actually want them to go back to school. Right now, I just want them to stay home. Oh, time flies. So for the kids, there's going to be a video in just a moment, and there's some question sheets back there, and so you can fill them out according to what's on the screen. Now, I think Laura Lee might have something in her office that if you come and show me the sheet, that I might be able to find something. I don't promise, because I'm not sure. Usually I go in her office and steal gum, and I tried to steal gum in her absence, and she must have locked it away, so here I am. But I think there might be something, and if not, I'll hang on to it, and I'll make sure that she gives you something next week. Offering. So if you look out in the foyer, you'll see where we have our little offering station. And so since the pandemic, offering's been a little bit different. And so you have the opportunity to give by either using the envelopes back there, by using the debit machine, or doing it automatically through a number of online means. Now, sometimes when we talk about giving, we don't fully understand what does all of that mean in terms of giving of our money. But the money goes to everything, really. Sometimes I remember at the last church I was at, people had lots of families who had started going back to church. And so a lot of them grew up in churches where giving wasn't really prioritized, and so they had no idea how churches run. And so everything from your staff to the building to the lights to programming, all of that comes because of your generosity. And so I had a chance to visit with Stephen and Ruth this week, and Stephen was saying that one of the most encouraging things is the way that people continue to support Westsprings when we were open, when we were closed, when things were going great, when things were struggling, and so we really appreciate your continued generosity. Processo's funeral is this week, and so I'm chatting with Mel following this service to kind of just figure out if they want to do the setup on Thursday or if we have to do it on Friday. And so if we need it done on Thursday, I will be reaching out to some people, and Marcy's going to help me to help do some of the either Thursday or Friday setup. We will need people on both days regardless, and we'll also need some help with drinks possibly as well. So I'm going to get that information today, and then we'll put out an email to the church and look for some help, and I will also call you. So please don't ignore when you see Keitha come across your iPhone. That's not the time to hang up. It's not the time to press the side button. So Marcy and I are working on that, and we really do thank you, and the family is so appreciative that they're able to use this space. The fitness class that Bridget's leading, that's this Saturday. I said it was last Saturday, but it's actually this Saturday, and it's at 9 a.m., and everyone's welcome. So kids, there's a quick video for you.
Stories of the Bible. Elijah in the wilderness. This is Elijah.
Hello.
Elijah was a prophet in Israel during the reign of King Ahab. This is King Ahab.
Whatever.
He came from the line of kings who did bad things, but King Ahab was the worst of them all. King Ahab and his wife Jezebel stopped following God and worshipped a fake god called Baal. Elijah's job was to tell the people of Israel and King Ahab to stop worshiping Baal and to worship God again. But King Ahab and Jezebel didn't like what Elijah had to say, or that he proved to everyone that God was more powerful than any other god. Elijah made Jezebel so angry that she wanted to kill him. She sent him a message saying, "May the gods strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you." Elijah was terrified and ran away. He went to a town and he left his servant there. Then he went on alone into the wilderness. He sat down under a tree and prayed that he might die. He said, "I have had enough, Lord." Then he lay down and fell asleep. But as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. Whoa! So he ate and drank and then laid down again. The angel of the Lord came again and touched him and again said, "Get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you." So he did, and it gave him the strength to get up and continue on his way to a place called Mount Sinai. Later, Elijah would do what God wanted him to and would tell the people of Israel to follow God again.
Alrighty, how's it going, everybody? My name is Eric. I'm going to be reading 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 29 to 33. In the 30th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel, and he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made the Asherah pole and did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than did all the kings of Israel before him.
What a legacy, eh? Can you imagine if someone wrote that about you? You've done more to provoke God than anyone. You guys are very quiet today. I thought that was funny. Man, get your skills together, Geetha. It would seem that it's a fair statement that what we believe about God or how we view God determines how we engage with him. And so if you believe God is a fairy tale, you would respond to God as though that was true. If you believe God is angry, perhaps ready to smite you, you might be tempted to respond to God from a distance and with a level of fear. And if you believe God is supposed to respond to all of your wants and requests in a very specific way, then you're going to be looking for God to respond to you that way. And you will be tempted to decipher why God isn't responding that way through a series of lenses and experiences. If you expect the things you do give you credit with God and lean you towards your protection and prosperity, if you are not protected or prosperous, you might find yourself somehow disappointed and disillusioned. Now, if your perception of God is centered perhaps on power and on privilege, you're going to seek out a life that moves you towards greater power and privilege as well. But perhaps you imagine that God is slow to anger, abounding in love, humble in heart, uncontrolling and deeply compassionate, and concerned about you and those around you. And while that too has the capacity to shape your response, to shape your view of God, of self, and of others. Now, today's passage is found in 1 Kings, and as I was reading through the passage, I was reminded of a childhood book that we had in our home. It was from a series of Arch children's books, and it detailed the life of Elijah, and specifically, I remember it talking about Jezebel. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a spoiler alert. At the end of the story, she dies. There's a lot of feedback, just so you know. So at the end of the story, she dies, and she's died because she's pushed out of a window. And I remember that part being in the book too. Now, as a kid, it didn't even faze me, but as a parent, it phases me quite a bit. Because we tend not to place a lot of value on our kids throwing things out of windows or going near the windows at all. But while that might raise some eyebrows, one of the things that is so prevalent when you hear about Jezebel and when you hear her name is that it's also been used as a misogynistic tool to despise women, to critique women, to belittle their contributions and their leadership. But rather than being framed by past ideas about Jezebel, I want us to be free enough to remove those stereotypes from what was familiar and comfortable, and responding instead to her as someone who had a lack of choice, with resolve. She was someone who had a lack of choice, and she chose to approach that with resolve rather than with defeat. In other words, I hope that we can kind of humanize her a little bit. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that she didn't do terrible things. It doesn't change how we think about idolatry. But hopefully as we get into her story and as it intersects with others, such as Ahab and Elijah, we're reminded that Scripture, when viewed as inspired rather than inerrant, invites us to ask some questions. It invites us to make some observations and hopefully to spark a conversation. So as you listen, I hope that you will have your own questions. And I hope that you're going to make your own observations. And I hope that you plan to have some conversations about it this week as well. So bear with me as we kind of go through the story a bit. So we start off with Ahab. Ahab is the son of King Omri. Now, if you care for a little bit of Game of Thrones on your Sunday morning, then you'll be interested to know that Omri took the throne from Zimri. Zimri took the throne from Elah. And everyone who did this did it in violent and retributive ways, ensuring the demise of the kings who had gone before, and in some cases, not only the king, but also their families and anyone who supported them. And I wonder if Ahab, having this kind of history and knowing and understanding the ways and history of royalty in his time, if this did not shape how he ruled, how he held power, and how he viewed God. Now, the text begins immediately telling us that Ahab is not a great person. And so we start off with this kind of negative view of him. And it's noted that Ahab does evil in the sight of God. And then it goes on to say, and if that's not enough, he also married Jezebel. And the text repeatedly reminds us that she's a character we're not supposed to identify with or appreciate in any way. She is dangerous. And Ahab, because of her and his own actions, is known as this terrible king in Israel's history. He often, though, when you read him, seems to operate out of fear. And this fear seems to show up primarily when Elijah is present and when the prophet speaks. Elijah shows up in 17 verse 1 and tells Ahab that it's not going to rain in Israel for 3 years. And Ahab, of course, he doesn't like this news and spends the next 3 years trying to find Elijah. And rumor has it that each time someone spots Elijah and tells the king, Elijah disappears. The messenger comes back, says, we found him. They go and look for him, can't find him. And then that messenger is killed. 3 years later, Elijah arrives, and it's in conversation with one of Ahab's servants that we get the picture of the state of the kingdom. Fear is everywhere. Prophets of Yahweh have been targeted and hunted for death. Food and water have been scarce, and the king is angry, not necessarily with God, but most definitely with Elijah. This is where that premise of that famed Mount Carmel scene comes to life. Ahab calls Elijah a troublemaker. Elijah boldly declares that Baal is powerless and Yahweh is powerful, and a competition between the gods ensues. In the end, Elijah wins as he bears witness to fire coming from heaven. And Ahab is once again outraged and perhaps even afraid. Elijah gathers the prophets of Baal and he kills them, and he later announces that rain is coming. And Ahab, rather than rejoicing or running to worship that it's about to rain or engaging with the prophet, runs to voice his concerns to Jezebel. Now, Jezebel, however, seems unafraid and ready to tackle the prophet whose God she just heard sent fire from heaven, and who has just killed hundreds of prophets of her deity. Now, remember what has just happened. Elijah's won, and he's announced good news that rain is coming. But the irony is this leaves Elijah terrified and running for cover. Her threats are too much, her presence too overwhelming, and suddenly his God is too small. Later on, we see that Ahab wants this piece of property, and when he's told no, he goes home sullen, uncertain, and almost fearful to take any kind of action. And he reports once again to Jezebel, and she, unafraid and strategic, takes the land and unflinchingly ensures that her husband wins. Then comes a battle. Israel at this point has been divided, and Ahab joins with the neighboring king in Judah, King Jehoshaphat, and takes down their united enemy. Now, the Judite king wants them to consult with the prophets. That we know Ahab does not like going to speak to the prophets of God, because he's always afraid of their words. He is always certain that they're not going to be in his favor. But the king insists, the other king insists, and once again Ahab is disappointed as the prophet announces, "You are going to die in this battle that you wish to undertake." Ahab tries to outsmart the enemy, outsmart the prophet, and outsmart his fellow king, and outsmart God, and in the end, he's left dead, killed in battle as it was prophesied. But Jezebel's story isn't over. She's very much still alive, and it will be a later king who eventually has her and all of her family killed. But even when facing death, Jezebel gets made up, gets dressed up, and remains defiant until the end. That is a condensed version of a lot of passages in 1st and 2nd Kings. But what I find interesting is the different ways that people respond to their situation and the different ways that people respond to God. Both Ahab and Elijah operate in the world dancing between powerful confidence and then this kind of debilitating fear. Ahab runs to Jezebel and Elijah runs away. And the irony in this is that both Ahab and Elijah would have had this foundational understanding about who God, Yahweh, is. It seems that Ahab has interpreted God through the lens of a killjoy. To engage with God, to engage with the prophets, to engage with those who seem to align with Yahweh was to engage with those who were prepared to critique him, who were prepared to put down what it was that he wanted to build, who were prepared to let him know about his failings. And so rather than allow the words of the prophet or his understanding about God to move him, and thus the nation towards godliness, towards worship, towards loving God with all of their hearts, Ahab chooses to avoid, dismiss, and to ignore God. He seems to have this idea that maybe, just maybe, he can skirt around the edges and God won't notice him. And if God doesn't notice, then essentially he can do whatever he wants. But this idea about God moves him away from leaning in or relying on God, and instead he chooses to rely on the wisdom of self and the wisdom of others. And so we see Ahab time and time again make choices based on who he thinks God is, rather than by making choices based on who God actually is. And so despite the powerful events on Mount Carmel, it seems that Ahab is far more content with the silence of Baal than with the presence of God. Now, my middle son, Emmanuel, whenever he gets in trouble, whatever that means, whenever he's not doing what he's supposed to do, and then we have the talk, and he gets reprimanded, and then I look at him, and I'm watching to make sure that he's now following the instruction, he has this, what we would say in my Jamaican household, he's being feisty. And so he's being feisty, and he'll look at me, and he'll say, "Mom, turn around." Which basically means, get out of my business. I don't want your interference. If you would turn around, then I can do what I want. And Ahab kind of operates with that same idea, where he silently reminds God over and over again, turn around so I can live however I want and treat others however I want. Now, when we look around in our modern world, we see what happens when power is grasped for and people and communities and nations want to grapple with this apart from godliness. We see what happens when success is grasped for and people and communities and nations want to handle this apart from godliness. We see what happens when control is taken and people and communities and nations want to control apart from godliness, which in essence is to act apart from love as our motivation. We see it, we experience, and at times we propagate it because it can appear easier to operate apart from God's interference and simply ask him to turn around. And the evidence of this is seen in poverty, it's seen in corrupt systems, it's seen in spaces that are not welcoming, it's evidenced in equity gaps, it's evidenced in all the spaces and places where the Spirit seems to be whispering to the church that apart from godliness that is in tune with deep love, nothing good is lasting. And I wonder what must shift in how we view God, so that our response to God at work in and around us and our response to the world around us is less Ahab-like and more like love. Then there's Elijah. And one would imagine that somehow Elijah's view of God is superior, and thus his response to God is elevated. But when I read the text, I'm always surprised by how inconsistent his engagement with God is. He seems to have this idea that God can do big things, God can do amazing things, remarkable, supernatural things for his people, for his community. But at the same time, this same God who loves and cares deeply about Israel cannot and does not care and love him deeply. And so we meet a prophet who can speak truth to power. He can give hope to someone who is struggling with loss. He can give courage to the servants and the staff of the king. He can stand face to face with his enemies. But what he doesn't seem to imagine is that this fire from heaven God, Yahweh, is active and present and reliable for him or in his situation. And as soon as the situation becomes personal, when it moves from nation building to just him and his great fears and his concerns and his troubles, he runs in the other direction. Perhaps you can relate to Elijah, having the gall and courage to believe that God can and will advocate for the broken, whether in those rare moments of a direct God-to-man encounter or those more frequent moments when God stirs the church into action, to be present and awareness to a community in pain or a friend in struggle or a societal struggle. In those moments, you can declare with confidence that God is. that God is present, that God is available, that God is active. Yet when it comes to our personal situations, when it comes to our pain, to our uncertain future, suddenly we change the direction of our conversation and insist that God is too busy, too big, and somehow incapable of carrying us, of sitting with us, of bearing our burdens. And so we run to find a way to fix it, to solve it, to create it, rather than to imagine and operate as though God is our shepherd, walking with us through the valley of the shadow of death, preparing a table in the presence of our enemies. And I wonder what would have changed in Elijah's story if he had that same deep faith and trust in God's provision for himself as he did for the people he spoke to about this powerful Yahweh. And what would shift in our stories if we too had the same deep faith and trust in God's provision and care for us and for ours and for the things that matter to our circles and our families, as we do in believing that God can do great things for others. Now, Jezebel's story is one that's full of irony. Dr. Will Gaffney offered this perspective that I found unusual and intriguing. She notes firstly that Jezebel is most likely a derogatory reframing of her actual name, that the author and perhaps the people of her day so disliked her and what she represented that they took her name Izuvul, which would have meant Baal exalts, and made mockery of it by calling her Jezebel, which would have been translated to something like lack of nobility and fecal matter. But it's her original name that seems to define her actions. While Ahab seems certain that the expectations of his God are too great and too costly, and Elijah seems certain that his God is too small and insignificant, or that he is too small and insignificant for God, there is Jezebel, the idol-worshiping princess who believes that Baal has exalted her, and that her devotion to this deity is so immense and deep and strong that she believes that not a single thing can condemn her, defeat her, or bring her down. She is so committed to Baal that she believes it is her work to kill on its behalf, to recruit on its behalf, and to live resolutely for its propagation and exaltation. Yes, Jezebel is the shame of Israel, because where they are easily swayed from God, where they are easily made uncertain about God's love and God's faithfulness, where they sense the cost is too high to follow, there is this foreign queen openly, unconditionally, and faithfully serving this idol, believing that she has been shaped and formed by it, and that this will sustain her. That which condemns her equally brings shame to Ahab, to Elijah, and to Israel. There is something about how Jezebel sees her God that leads her to operate with deep faithfulness, commitment, and deference. There's something about how she views this lifeless idol's power and presence in the world that points her towards a life that is shaped and formed by its values and ethics and ethos. Now, to be clear, I'm not, espousing idol worship, so don't go home and take that as your go-home point. In fact, worship of Baal was full of deeply evil things: self-mutilation, ritual sexual practice, all kinds of things that were abhorrent and demeaning to humanity. And so it's not her worship of Baal that one can or should celebrate. However, I do think her view of her deity is something that stands in stark contrast with the Israelites' response to Yahweh. In the book of Isaiah, the prophet wonders who but a fool would make his own God, an idol that cannot help him one bit. He uses part of the wood to make a fire and takes the rest to make a God to worship. Now, rarely will you in modern society find someone, in modern Western society, find someone making gods and goddesses out of wood and stone. But there are many who would make God in their own image, or make God according to their circumstances and their fear and their ideas and their experiences. And while we do believe that God is contextual, speaking into specific times and moments in history, calling people to live and act and rethink how they live and act, I wonder in this moment about what it is about how the church has viewed God that we are being called to rethink, that we are being called to reconsider. I wonder in this moment in our personal lives if there are spaces that God is shaping you and calling you towards deeper faithfulness. I wonder if in this moment, if God is reshaping how you understand your worth and your value and how easy you are to love. I wonder, as I think about ancient kings and queens and prophets, if their stories can remind us and call us back to faithfulness, call us back to love and godliness. I wonder what the retelling of Ahab and Elijah and Jezebel, if they have anything to offer you and me and us together. But as I go into these stories of these characters that I've heard about for decades, I wonder if the small lessons we can pull from them, the small observations we can make, can sometimes overshadow what we can learn about who God is. And so for all of Ahab's unfaithfulness, for Jezebel's faithlessness, and for Elijah's wavering belief, I have to imagine that in it all, there was God still faithful. There was God still present for his people. There was God still offering redemption, still longing for relationships, still wanting love to lead them. And so as I read Jesus, it becomes evident that regardless of the best and the worst of us, there is God faithful. There is God active. You guys can come up. There is God present, beckoning and inviting us to faithfulness, inviting us to be active, inviting us to be present with him and with others. How do you view God? How does Jesus shift your ideas about what God is like and who you are called to be? The dance of Scripture should lead us to ask questions, to make observations, and to have conversations. And so as we come to communion, may the God who is, may the God who was, may the God who always will be, may he meet you in the humility of the cross. May he meet you in the glory of the resurrection, in the revelation of the Spirit, and in the promise of the kingdom. And in it all, may we be shaped by who God is. Let's stand up.